Hello everybody. Today we're going to look at 1950s Newcastle, which was an interesting time. It was post-war and the city had a lot of allegations of slum housing, terrible conditions for many residents. Some areas were in the process of being demolished to be updated in what would become the concrete jungles of the 60s and 70s, but we'll get into those another time. Because in these rundown housing conditions is an era where we find many unsolved murders and strange deaths, and I thought we could look at three of the more interesting and mysterious ones today. So for our first one, we're going to go to Central Station, which is Newcastle's main interchange on the rail system. Building of the station started in around 1847, and by August 1850, Queen Victoria herself opened it. Now we're going to jump forward to the 26th of October, 1955. And by this time the station was far bigger, bustling with multiple platforms. This was the centre of Newcastle's rail commerce. Things came and went by this station by incredible numbers, and that's where we find Mr. James Faraday Judge, dead in a cloakroom cubicle. And why was his death strange? Because he was found to have drowned. Now Newcastle Station is a good 300 foot above the nearest body of water, the River Tyne, but his lungs were found to be full of fluid, and the coroner could not find a reason to explain this. He was found fully dressed, and there were no signs of any containers or poison that he might have taken, or any liquid source at all, and no drugs were found in his system. But it gets even more strange. James was an engineering inspector and trade unionist, and lived in Benton in Newcastle. But in the week of his death, it was found that he had been pretending to go to work. He allegedly wasn't turning up. On the Monday and Tuesday of the week of his death, he left home for work as usual, returned home at the correct time, seemed happy, but he had certainly not gone to his job. He was supposed to go to work in Blythe on these days, and his wife said when he returned, everything seemed as normal. Nothing in his personal life was found to be causing any worry. There were no debts found. He was said to be a good worker and an active trade unionist. So something happened on the Monday and Tuesday, and then on the Wednesday he's found drowned in a cubicle in Central Station. The police tried to find out where he had been and what had happened, and you might think, trade unionist, could it have been something to do with that? Well, no, nobody came forward, and there were no witnesses. It was never discovered where he had been in the days, or what had caused his lungs to fill with fluid. The judge in the case made an open verdict, and that was it. The case went cold. So let's look at this logically. He allegedly just not turned up for work on Monday and Tuesday, and then is found dead on the Wednesday. Lungs full of fluid. Obviously medicine was not great in the 1950s, so I decided to look into other deaths I could find with similar facts, and I think I might have come up with something. Now, you can die from a slow build-up of fluid on the lungs due to illness, but it's not usual to be living a normal active life with a full-time job while this is happening. Then something interesting caught my eye. Rapid build-up of fluid on the lungs can be caused by contact or exposure to certain toxins. Now we know that James was an engineer inspector, and I'm thinking, could he have been inspecting something on the Monday and Tuesday in which he was exposed to toxins which brought on his rapid death? Perhaps something that his employers have tried to cover up. Well, that's my best guess. Certainly some chicanery was afoot here. Put your own theories in the comments below. But this isn't the only strange death to come out of Central Station. But before we get into that, I want to take you very slightly up the road to Churchill Street, where we find Amy Browell's shop, situated between two derelict building sites and in an area of the city that was said to be rather dangerous. Indeed, there had been 6 unsolved murders in this area in the previous 10 to 20 years. Amy had been running the shop for a long time. When the shop first opened, this was a reasonably nice area, a built-up, working-class area of Newcastle on the edge of the city. But during and after the war, it had gone downhill fast. In fact, most of the street that the shop was in had now been demolished. Many of her previous customers had been relocated to new housing, but some would still return to the shop to give their patronage to her. However, at 6 p.m. on Thursday the 26th of February 1959, her nightly taxi which took her home arrived and found that she was nowhere to be seen. So the taxi driver, slightly worried, entered the shop, where sadly he found her body on the floor, on the customer side of the counter. The taxi driver alerted the authorities and the investigation started. Police said that they thought that robbery was the motive and that they were dealing with capital murder as money had been stolen from the shop. At the time, capital murder meant that the crime could be punished with a death sentence. Interestingly, the day after the murder, Newcastle called in Scotland Yard. The chief constable said that he did this just because he wanted to make sure that the investigation was first class and that nothing was overlooked. It was found that Amy's shop had once flourished, but that following the demolition work in the surrounding area, that when she died, she was in considerable debt. It was also heard that whilst being greatly respected, she had no real friends and lived a quiet life, although, as far as it was discovered, she didn't have any enemies. There are a few strange facts about this case, though. It's not known how much money the killer took, but there was some money that was left behind. A nearby pub landlady said that Amy bought his stock day to day, that she didn't have much money. In fact, earlier that day, the landlady herself had lent Amy £3. She didn't think there would have been much money in the shop to steal, so it's strange if there was money left behind. Men on a nearby building site said that a man had been hanging around the area trying to sell them petty stolen clothes and other items a few days before the murder. What struck them as odd is that he was putting on a terrible Geordie accent, trying to pass himself off as a local. But the builders suspected that he was probably Irish, and at least one of the builders saw him again just after the murder took place elsewhere in town. It later emerged that the shop had been broken into more than 20 times before this took place. Amy died without putting up a fight. Nevertheless, she was badly beaten and had a broken leg. Her body was found on the customer side of the counter and not behind it on the staff side. So it's possible to look at this from two angles. Either Amy knew her attacker and should come out from behind the counter to help him with something, or she was attacked while trying to escape from her own shop. Police said that the murderer might have been in the meatpacking business or handling trade, and that the murder weapon was most likely a meat chopper. Soon after, police said that they were trying to trace a man that was seen to enter the shop at about 3:30 p.m, but no one had seen him leave. He was seen by the landlady of the nearby Coach and Wagons public house at about 3:10 p.m. With no firm leads in place, the police decided to put up an offer of £1,000. That's about £17,000 in 2022. The police speculated that the murderer was probably not part of Newcastle's crime underworld. They said that if there had been a suspect amongst other criminals, there would have been at least a whisper. Scotland Yard's boys did no better either. They also found no suspects. There was, however, a somewhat similar murder 3 years later, that of 70-year-old Catherine Armstrong, who was found battered to death at her home on Gospink Lane, about 2 miles away from Churchill Street. That too went unsolved. With no further leads, the murder of Amy Browell remains a cold case. Now, for our final case, we're going to return to Central Station. But this time, no death occurs there, but the beginning of an unsolved murder does. We're looking at taxi driver Sydney John Dunn. Sydney had picked up a fare from Newcastle Central Station for Edmund Byers at about 4:30 a.m. Now, Edmund Byers is quite a taxi ride, especially at 4:30 a.m. in the winter. It would have taken at least an hour there and an hour back. Now, the 8th of December 1957 was an icy night, so it could have been even longer. But there was no return journey for Sydney, because his body was found 16 hours later, lying face down in the heather on the moors near Edmund Byers. He had been shot in the head, and there were said to have been bloodstains on the driving seat of the abandoned taxi. During their immediate search, the police said that they found several objects from Sydney Dunn's pockets not far from his body. The police couldn't figure out a motive for this. The taxi was left there, the guy was killed, left in the heather, and even his personal possessions, while they had been taken out of his pockets, they were just dumped at the roadside. This was going to be a strange one. And the sad thing is, Sydney almost avoided this altogether. Another taxi driver said that 2 men asked to hire his taxi at the station. The one wanting to go to Edmund Byers and another guy who wanted to go to Newburn. And this other taxi driver said he would take them both, drop one off, and then drop the other one off. But just as he was arranging this deal, Sydney turned up and said he would take the Edmund Byers ride. So this is still an unsolved case, obviously. But the next bit it's somewhat odd, because this case is not that there's no suspects of the murder, it's that there are 3, and it's still unsolved. Yes, so suspect number 1. A little later in the month, on 23rd of December, we pop over to the church hall kitchen in Gosforth. The people running this said that they remembered a man coming in a raincoat and begging for money, asking to get home to Edinburgh. Now this is interesting because the other taxi driver, the one that nearly took the fare, said that the guy wanting to go to Edmund Byers had what sounded like a Scottish accent. So the people at the church hall, after hearing the police appeal, kind of matched this up and said, well, this guy seemed quite desperate to get back to Edinburgh, and he had a Scottish accent. So they showed the reverend of the church some sketches that were made of the taxi passenger by the other taxi driver. And he said, yeah, this guy that was in the church, this is your man, this is the guy. But there was no easy way of tracing him. And then the next day, in Hexham, which is just along the river from Newcastle, a man was charged with theft at the magistrate's court, and he confessed to killing Sidney Dunn. So they took him to Durham prison, and in January sent him for a medical evaluation, because this guy had 228 previous convictions to his name, and he was saying that he had murdered Sidney Dunn. It was then discovered that he had been previously certified insane, so they weren't sure what to make of this, and with no evidence tying this guy to the crime except for his own confession, the case didn't go any further. But then, again, we have another suspect a few days later, and this one could be going somewhere, because it was the serial killer Peter Manuel. So it turns out that Peter, who is known for murdering at least 7 people in Scotland, and some of these murders were just over the border, had been in Newcastle 2 days before Sydney's murder for a job interview. Now, the Peter Manuel serial killer story is a wild story in itself, and I might cover it in another video. But for now, just know that he was a madman who would have been entirely capable of randomly shooting a taxi driver for no reason. And police also claimed that they found a button which matched the button style of one of the coats that Peter was known to have worn. That seems to be their little link. It's a little bit tenuous. And then conveniently for everybody, Peter was then sentenced to death for the 7 murders, was executed, and then they seem to have been like, well, it's probably him that killed the taxi driver, so we'll just leave things as a cold case. And that's where it ends. So yeah, I know that we've said it before, and justice used to be a little bit strange. But in this case, you've got a reverend of a church saying that they had a guy who matched the description and sketches of the taxi passenger in their church begging a few days after the murder. And then you've got a guy in Hexham who is confessing to the murder. And we've got Peter Manuel, who was in town 2 days before for a job interview, and no one knows when or how he got back to Edinburgh. Now, you might think that they questioned Peter about this case, and they did, but he went to his execution in complete denial of his crimes and came up with the most preposterous explanations in court for them, where he did defend himself. So that was that. 3 suspects, and the police conveniently decided to blame it on the one that was now dead. And there we have it. 3 unsolved murders from 1950s Newcastle. Thank you for listening. The next video that we're doing is a whole different kind of horror, and I'm really looking forward to doing it. But until then, don't have nightmares and do sleep well.